Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast is sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. When the United States declared war in April 1917, it had to mobilize to fight the war in Europe. The 48 states that made up the United States at the time would all play an important role in mobilization, both in terms of manpower and in terms of the home front. Every state made a unique contribution that reflected its history, its politics, its natural resources, and its level of industrialization, and its National Guard, volunteers, and draftees. Today, we will focus on the contributions of Mississippi, and we are joined by Tommy Lofton, Museum Director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here. This is pretty awesome.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Mississippi on the eve of the United States entering the war?
Sure. I'm not going to go too deep into how World War I started because I'm assuming most of your listeners have already kind of tracked how that came to be or what happened with that. But Mississippi itself was basically, I would say, a patriotic state, but also one that was economically suffering in a lot of ways too. We had a lot of farming going on here, very agricultural type of industry, if you will, for this state, and you don't have as many industrial facilities like you would see in the Northeast and other parts of the country at that time. But as we get into World War I, we have several units that actually within the Mississippi National Guard had already been down fighting along the border and fighting with Pershing, actually chasing Pancho Villa around and sort of testing their skills down there. It was not really a big common thing for us to have had much warfare or connection to warfare since the Civil War as a state. And so there was a little bit of experience on the entrance of World War I by some of our folks who were within our National Guard, but by and large, most of the state itself had not really had military service since the 1860s.
What I found really interesting in doing some of the background research for this was that support for the war obviously wasn't universal in the United States, but it certainly wasn't in Mississippi. In 1917, Mississippi has 2 U.S. senators, and they totally disagree. They're both Democrats, but one supports the declaration of war, one does not. What does this tell us about the divisions within Mississippi society? And was the memory of the American Civil War a factor in how people in Mississippi viewed the war?
Sure, we'll take the first question there, actually. And you're right, there were 2 senators from Mississippi who were very much in opposition with one another and holding 2 very different viewpoints of World War I on the eve of the war, and even once the country is entering the war. You had Senator John Sharp Williams, who was very much in favor of the United States entering World War I. And a lot of his backing was actually your larger planters within the state and your business leaders. And he actually kind of drew upon the mythology of the lost cause coming from the Civil War and used that in such a way to try to justify entry into World War I and his approach and his arguments. He felt and spoke in such a way that he believed the opponents of the war were actually traitors to the United States. And he kind of expressed that it would be better to die with honor than die as a coward in your service. And he actually had 3 of his 4 sons enter the military, which he was extremely proud of and used during his time there in service as a senator. On the opposite side, you have Senator James K. Vardaman, and he was very much an outspoken opponent to America's entry into World War I. He was more representative of the smaller agrarian small farms of the state, and he wasn't really, I would say, arguing much in the reference of the lost cause, but was more looking at this war especially as a rich man's war with poor man fighting it. So rich man's war, but poor man's fight. And actually, when it came down to the vote on the national level, he was one of 6 senators who actually voted against America's entry into the war. His efforts to vote against that, of course, were failure, and it cost him his next election. But yeah, two very opposing thought processes going on as America and Mississippi enter World War One. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, and for a lot of Mississippians, still had ties to the Civil War in a lot of ways. You had obviously such a very difficult time with the war going on within the state, but also the state of Mississippi having soldiers fighting all over the South during the Civil War, and then coming home and having to deal with Reconstruction, rebuild their homes, rebuild their livelihoods. And for many years after that, still struggling in a lot of ways to do that. But I think also for some, in reflections and looking at letters and things too, I think some saw this as a maybe a valiant way or an effort to redeem Mississippi's military service, military history, and take some pride in doing something good for mankind or for the country, as far as individual opinions at the time. And I think, looking back at having, if you will, lost the Civil War, this was a chance to redeem the military and redeem the state's opinion of itself and to the rest of the country.
So I think we see a little bit of that with other states in regards to, say, the Spanish American or the Philippine American War. Would you say that for Mississippi, this kind of turning the corner after the Civil War is World War One, not for like other states, Spanish
Sure.
American or Philippine? Okay.
Yeah, Mississippi we did have service members in Spanish American War and some that served with distinction, but I would say a much larger effort in military service and in military and national pride is seen within World War One. And I would argue that too with what we'll get into further with training sites here within the state and how the civilian population continues to get more involved as World War One goes on. I think more people felt connected to World War One and felt more patriotism in a greater sense of a new change in the opinion of Mississippi in a lot of ways. I think, again, not to take away from the Spanish American War veterans from the state of Mississippi, but I think the bigger impact is seen in our service within World War One.
Very interesting. Okay, so once the United States declares war, we know we have state National Guard units that are going to be very key to building up the American Expeditionary Forces. And in July 1917, the Mississippi Army National Guard is called into service. So, what particular units are mobilized and where are they going to serve during the war?
So what I will go to first is we had a unit tying back to the Mexican War, affectionately known as the 1st Mississippi Rifles or 1st Mississippi Infantry Regiment. And they had actually been serving in Mexico just before the war, came back to the state, to Jackson, and were actually disbanded as a unit and then released or mustered out of service that day. And then they turned right around a few hours later to be mustered into federal service for World War One, and their unit actually transitioned into a brand new nomenclature or newly assigned name with the 155th Infantry Regiment. And the 155th is actually a unit that still exists today within the Mississippi National Guard. They are the first of the 155th and still quite proud of their lineage going back from the Mexican War, but also their service in World War One. A lot of our units within the state end up actually not seeing a ton of action. They spend a lot of time training. They go overseas and become replacements. They, like a lot of states, had men pulled out of their units and pulled into other divisions. And once they get to England or into Europe itself, they were really going to be a major part of the 39th Division, which didn't obviously see a lot of action as late as it collectively formed and got overseas. But we had the 155th being our probably largest infantry unit. We had several ammunition units, transportation units, machine gun units, and we had an engineering unit, the 114th Engineers. So we had a little bit of everything in some sense going overseas. On top of that, also, not just the National Guard, we had a number of other individuals who also volunteered into regular active duty service, and some who got into aviation and other service branches, got into the Navy or had been serving in the Navy even. So that's something that we take a great deal of pride in as a state.
In total, do we know how many soldiers from Mississippi served in the war? And of those, do we have good numbers in terms of killed and wounded?
So we know that we actually had a large number of Mississippians who registered for the draft, as the draft forms. And by September 12th, 1918, the numbers we have here are 344,724 Mississippians actually registered for the draft. And according to the biennial report for the Adjutant General's Office from Mississippi from 1918-1919 publication, we have approximately 173,082 African Americans registered for service from the state of Mississippi and 171,424 whites registered for the draft. So that makes roughly 63,325 Mississippians that actually end up serving out of those numbers. Again, that those draft numbers are just who signed up to serve. That doesn't mean everybody was called into service or put into service. But yeah, we had at least 63,325 Mississippians in all service branches serving during the war. As far as killed or wounded, the numbers are a little bit all over the place. The records are not exactly great from that time, too. I've seen everything from over 700 to in the ballpark of maybe more like 900. Mississippians are killed in World War One, but definitely we had some very serious casualties and heroes that we honor here within our museum who were killed in action and service in World War One or died from disease and all the other horrible things going on within the war as well.
Now, you mentioned the service of African Americans. Now, approximately 380,000 African Americans served in the U.S. Army during the war. Most of them come from the South. I think in terms of North Carolina, we know about 25% of the soldiers coming out of North Carolina are African American. I think for Virginia, it's close to 40%. What does that number look like for Mississippi? And what do we know about the recruitment or draft of African Americans there?
Well, we know again, 63,325 Mississippians is sort of the accepted number of who served. We think records, on African American service are very difficult from that time period, but we have been able to estimate pretty comfortably that we think about 25,000 African Americans served from Mississippi out of that number of 63,000 or 63,000 plus. So a pretty significant number from the state and quite a few attempting to serve early on. There was still obviously segregation going on at this time, as we know in American history. And it actually became an issue where in certain counties, in certain parts of the state, there was a quota for registering individuals to draft based on race. And in some of these areas that were actually the white individuals were a minority within that county, they had trouble meeting the quota. And so some of the leaders within the state tried to use blacks to pad the numbers and still meet the national requirements. And I think the governor at the time sort of supported that. But thankfully, the federal government came back and discovered that and pressed the issue with the state and with the governor and requiring that you can't use more African Americans to cover the numbers of whites to go overseas and serve. And so trying to make it more fair based on the population of that county. And so we also see some difficulties too with other things going on in the nation where some blacks were actually discouraged from drafting and didn't really get to do so, or not just drafting, but enlisting, and didn't really get to do so until later in the war. But we obviously, with approximately 25,000 African Americans in service in the state, we had a pretty significant number serving. There's one individual too I'd like to highlight kind of quickly, if you are okay with that. It's a guy that fascinates me as we were doing some research on one of our exhibits here and updating it. A guy named John Rucker, fascinating individual. He's an African American from Natchez, Mississippi. And after he graduated high school, he studied theology and actually earned a Doctor of Divinity degree. And also at the same time dreamed of being a doctor, medical doctor. So he went to medical school and he earned his medical degree. This is all before World War One. Became an ordained Baptist minister, and then as America entered World War One, he was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division and served not only the medical needs but also could serve the spiritual needs of the men within his unit. And to me, his story is fascinating. He comes back home after the war, survives the war, ends up in frontline actions and frontline medical situations in hospitals, having to work on men and save their lives, comes home and ends up actually getting into education as well. And I believe becomes the first or one of the first African American principals within the state. And he ends up in Tennessee for quite a while and then comes back to Mississippi. But to me, also I could argue, and I think a lot of others would agree, he's probably one of the earlier pioneers of civil rights, coming out of World War One, having served in the military, and then continuing to press, against the time period of segregation to continue. I mean, again, to have a doctorate of divinity, to be a medical doctor, and have an education degree, and be able to serve as an educator, a minister, and a doctor. All that's three different lives rolled into one. Pretty phenomenal.
Very, very impressive. Do you want to share some stories from other soldiers from Mississippi?
Oh, sure. Would love to. We actually, as a state, had a unique opportunity in that we had seven generals that we provided to the war itself. I'm not going to go through all seven of those, but I do want to address at least one of my favorites. And it's a guy who is often overlooked, I would say, in history, in our state's history, but also in the U.S. history. And he was right there with General Pershing. He was the right-hand man of General Pershing, and his name was Fox Connor. Fox Connor was actually appointed or picked by General Pershing to be chief of operations and was very instrumental in building the American Expeditionary Forces. Again, sort of been lost to history, but he is a huge and highly respected individual within our state and should be also within our country. Basically, any major strategic decision and operational decision that America or American troops had during the Western Front campaign of World War One, he had in some way had his hands involved in how to either launch those attacks or major defenses against the enemy. So quite a fascinating man who went on to a great career after World War One and actually became a major and significant mentor to a very young officer named Dwight Eisenhower. So quite a interesting individual, and I would love for your listeners to do a little searching and find out what they can about Fox Connor, because again, he's just another name sort of lost to history. Another interesting fact too is that one of General Pershing's main aides to his staff there was a guy named John George Queckemeyer, who was also from Mississippi, from Yazoo City. And he actually was wounded in combat. You see him quite frequently when you have photographs of General Pershing out there awarding medals to troops. Queckemeyer is actually standing behind him, either with a citation or unclasping the next medal or whatever. But I say he looks sort of like Tom Selleck. He's behind him with a mustache, very slim, tall individual, and highly respected by Pershing. In fact, they kept in touch after the war, and Queckemeyer himself was actually on his way to a great career. In 1926, he was actually appointed as the commandant of West Point and was in the process of taking that command, but then unfortunately contracted pneumonia and died shortly after that. Or else, he could have been a significant leader in the next World War, potentially, had he still been in military service. Another individual to highlight is Samuel Kay, or some say Samuel Coy. He was a Mississippian and probably our highest decorated aviator from the state. He earned two Distinguished Service Crosses flying with the 91st Aero Squadron, the Hat in the Ring gang. They're flying with Eddie Rickenbacker. Quite a fascinating individual. We have his uniform on display. He had four confirmed kills. One of those, he actually flew out the next day, I believe, after shooting that German aircraft down, rips the machine gun out of the aircraft and brings it home. And we actually have that machine gun, the aerial machine gun, on display with a shot counter, actually, that was attached to it as well, that would show how many rounds the German pilot had expended, and a piece of the airplane and a few other things that came with that machine gun. So we're quite proud of that. And then also in the 24th Aero Squadron, we had, I want to mention Samuel Reeves Keesler. And if some of your listeners may be familiar with the name Keesler, it's from Keesler Air Force Base. He was a rear seat gunner and photographer, was badly wounded when he and his pilot were jumped by four German fighters. Keesler actually shot down the first of the four in line, but unfortunately their aircraft was just riddled full of bullet holes. So he and his pilot had to crash land, and his pilot got out. And to make a long story short, as Keesler was continuing to fire and reload, the pilot comes back to help him get out of the airplane and realizes he's been hit in the chest and the abdomen. That evening, he ends up bleeding out without having any close medical care. And with the wounds that he has, it's difficult to survive from even today. But then in 1941, and that was actually a month shy of coming home from the war, by the way, in 1941, they built a major airfield in Mississippi. They're looking for a name for it, for a hero to name it after, and Keesler Air Force Base is what it's known as today, and still a very important component to the United States military. And we also, to give you one other one, James Howell Grantham. Howell was unique individual. He was in school here, probably didn't have to serve, but decided to, wanted to become a Navy corpsman, was assigned to the Marine Corps, was in multiple battles and campaigns there with the Marines. And right at the end of the war, fighting in the Meuse-Argonne, he actually is in the process of having saved several individuals' lives already. He's working on a Marine, rolls over to the other side of that individual, saves his life, but also absorbs the incoming enemy fire. And Grantham, unfortunately, is killed in action. And this was just 10 days before the end of World War I. This was November the 1st, 1918. For his heroic actions, he actually receives the Navy Cross, which we now have in the collection, and understand that it's one of the last, if not possibly the last, Navy Cross issued in World War I in the United States. So we're quite proud to have that and to be able to tell his story. And even in his letters, he writes to his mother saying, don't fret for me if something happens to me in war. And he actually has a line that we've pulled out in the exhibit that says, besides, it's not so bad to die. And when I think about all the things medically that he was seeing in the Marines he was treating, it's such an impact standing there looking at his exhibit within our World War One recreated trench. It's hard. It's easy for us to remember, World War II and other generations that are still around and still with us, but we don't need to lose sight on some of these World War One heroes that we have in all of our states here within the United States.
It sounds like you have an incredible collection there. Lots of incredible stories that you can tell with it. So, changing gear a little bit, like many other states, Mississippi hosts the military training camps for troops bound for Europe. Tell us about Camp Shelby.
So Camp Shelby came to be because of World War One. They were actually looking in a few other locations in the state of Mississippi to build a major training site for the country and for the state. And thankfully, we had the opportunity to pitch the Hattiesburg area, which is where Camp Shelby is located today. It was a young, sort of up and coming area. You had several medical doctors here who were either in prior military service or still in the military or the National Guard at the time. And they saw the potential for this area with a ton of medical support, with a great community here. And so they actually had a little bit of influence too, and brought a very important man down here who was tasked with deciding on where and if the facility would be built in Mississippi. And his name was Leonard Wood. And General Leonard Wood came down here. It's my understanding, came to the train station area and was treated about like Elvis coming to town. The local population showed up and was so excited to see him. And these folks brought him out here just outside of Hattiesburg, a few miles down the road, to a big giant open area that was owned by a lumber company, the Newman Lumber Company. And they had actually harvested most of the timber here, so it was wide open country. But also something that was a huge advantage for the government was they had a major rail line that connected to the rail line in town where they could move all of that timber off site and elsewhere into the country. So the infrastructure was already here on the site. So my understanding that General Leonard Wood was very impressed with that, went to see the other sites in the state, and then upon returning back to, I think, New York, may have been Washington, he and the others, or the War Department, sent a telegram down, and Camp Shelby is placed right here outside of Hattiesburg. And some of the first soldiers to come here were actually from the state of Kentucky, and they actually are the ones who gave the name to Camp Shelby. It's named for Isaac Shelby, who, as far as we know, never came to Mississippi, but he was a huge hero of Kentucky. He was a territorial governor there, the first governor of Kentucky, and was a huge hero of the Revolutionary War and of the War of 1812. Battle of Kings Mountain's a big one for him. And so when the 38th Division formed and came down here to Camp Shelby, named it Camp Shelby, and began to build all of the buildings, the facilities, and the structure and the infrastructure here for other units to follow. And we actually had the 37th here, the 38th here, and the 101st Division actually formed here at Camp Shelby. And we know that in the ballpark of 40,000 troops actually trained here for World War One. So we were a pretty significant training site at that time and still continue to have that legacy today. Our history we trace all the way back to 1917, and we've pretty much been involved in every major war and conflict since then. Probably our biggest challenging time there was World War II. With the amount of troops that we were training here, we were thought to be the second largest training site in the country at that time. But yeah, Camp Shelby's legacy definitely goes back to 1917. And a lot of the locals loved this place, supported it. They also built a major medical center here, which was extremely influential in the southern part of the state. And it's my understanding was very helpful and supportive of the local community as well as the military facility when the Spanish flu epidemic hit this area pretty hard.
So we've talked about Camp Shelby. We've talked about the troops coming out of Mississippi. How would you say Mississippi mobilizes for war in terms of just the more general home front and the
Sure.
civilians left behind?
Yeah, so Mississippi itself, of course, again, there was some difference of opinion as the war broke out, but as it continues on and more Mississippians get involved, you do have a great number of patriotic individuals who get involved. And we actually see in the state and also the nation women having to step into the workforce in a lot of places around here or run the farms that their husbands and sons and other family members were running. So, we talked earlier about this being a major agrarian and agricultural state. It fell a lot on the family members, the younger family members, and the women to continue to run those farms and run the businesses here in the state. We also had rationing here at the time that was very difficult in some ways, but then also with having farms here, from some of the things I've read, a lot of families didn't know any difference. They felt that it was pretty much just another day in some instances of within the rationing concept. And we actually had women who joined the military forces and became auxiliary members of various service branches and did their best to become nurses, to work with soldiers here stateside or travel overseas and try to work as nurses for the military and do anything that they could to support the troops and support the young men and the old men who were overseas in service and the boys from back home.
All right, time for some final thoughts now. What do you think is Mississippi's World War One legacy?
I would argue that World War One legacy for Mississippi is what's really put Mississippi on the map in a great way in modern history. Up to this point, our state really forms after the Revolutionary War. We do have a major hand in the War of 1812, and especially within the Battle of New Orleans itself. But World War One, I think, really brought Mississippi to the forefront. You have individuals who come here from other states. We have a major training site with Camp Shelby, plus smaller camps and other areas that are built and exist really only for World War One. There's such a huge boom in military service within the communities here. You have a lot of heroes who come out of this war and come back home, either to the United States or the state itself, who really set the bar high for the next generation coming along. Of course, they don't know that there's another World War on the horizon, but as that World War approaches, some of your senior leaders, even within the National Guard or active duty units out there from all service branches, come from Mississippi and from their experiences in World War One and their training and their service overseas. And they have mentors they still keep in touch with, like General Fox Connor. That's a huge pivotal thing for the state and for forming some sense of legitimacy, but also moving into a new sense of pride and military pride, especially in the post-Civil War era. So from World War One to today, I would say when you look at Mississippi and Mississippi's military legacy and Mississippi's military history, we take a whole lot of pride now in what we do, and that's why we have the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. This museum exists to help the country, but maybe more importantly, our own state, to not forget the legacy of our Mississippi military. And we do cover basically pre-War of 1812 through the modern conflicts here within this museum. And I hope that some of your listeners, if they get the chance or they're passing through Mississippi, take the chance to come to our museum. It's open to the public 9 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday, and we're a free museum. And you will see quite a number of stories from various wars and conflicts and individuals that some of us have heard of and didn't really know that most people didn't know they had ties to Mississippi or came from Mississippi originally. So you have a great legacy of pride and service in World War One, but you also have a lot of important individuals and, like I said, a lot of the leaders and individuals who get involved in future wars and conflicts, some making major decisions for the United States, come right here from this state.
Tommy, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to plan to come and visit myself. I think it sounds like you have a great collection, and I think Mississippi has a fascinating history. So I'll be there.
Awesome. We look forward to having you come down.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.